Hello and welcome to episode 21 and 22 Crossfire and Contraband, Serbia-Kosovo conflict, drug trafficking, and the connection with terrorism. Today, to have a deep dive into such a wide range of topic, we have today with us Adam Rousselle, and he will be taking us on a kind of tour of what happens on the geopolitical front as well as inside the trafficking rackets and its connection with the terrorism. So, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Likewise, thank you very much for giving us your precious time, Adam. So, before we start with the topic, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself and how did you end up, being such an expert in a niche area?
Well, I don't know if I'd say it's quite so niche. I tend to be kind of a generalist when it comes to research, but my background is in like university days. I did history and political science as an undergraduate and as a master's degree. Um, Since then, I've worked as an editor. I currently work in financial research in the commodities business. So we publish reports for clients that help them understand some of the risks associated with global supply chains, specific to the iron ore and steel business. But I also work with Militant Wire out of Canada, which is a fantastic company started by my childhood friend Lucas Weber, and we cover a whole broad range of global security issues. Um, Lucas will tend to put me onto something, and I'll do a deep dive into it, and produce reports and kind of get get into things. Sometimes I take the initiative and I'll go find something that's really a flashpoint on my own. The Serbia-Kosovo conflict has been one that's been of particular interest to me, as well as the issue of the drug war in Mexico. Both massive geopolitical flashpoints that I think will have long-standing ramifications, and that's the kind of research I like to get into.
Interesting. Thank you very much for giving us a broad perspective about your background and your area of interest and your research expertise too. And without any delay, I would like to, as you mentioned, this is a very complex geopolitical landscape. Without any delay, I would like to, straight away dive into the topic. So, from your perspective, what are the root causes of the Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and how have they evolved over time?
Well, it's a bit of a complicated question, Omkar, but I think if we're looking at just this current issue that we're seeing today, the root, long story short, is there was a very brief but brutal war in Kosovo in 98, 99 that resulted in independent Kosovo. Within that state, there were at the time some 300,000 ethnic Serbs, or about 120,000 now. They've long complained of having limited access to opportunities, difficulty moving throughout the country, different things like that. They're primarily concentrated in the north along the border region, though there are a few municipalities in the south. Um, Serbia does not recognize Kosovar sovereignty. They're not the only one. In fact, about half the world doesn't actually recognize. Serbia had previously been issuing license plates to ethnic Serbs living in Kosovo, and the Kosovar state began denying them entry at the border. This became a massive issue because a lot of ethnic Serbs in Kosovo travel to see family in Serbia. Some of them even make their living across to the other side of the border. So it became a huge issue, especially if they're being denied access to own, uh, their own country. So a few months later, you have ethnic Serbs refusing to take part in local elections. including ethnic Serbian parties. The result was the complete boycott of these elections and the default appointment of, or election, I suppose, of ethnic Albanian mayors. When these mayors attempted to take office, there were widespread protests in the dominantly Serbian municipalities. And there's been huge clashes with NATO peacekeepers operating within the region. I think some 34 have been injured to date in these protests and conflicts.
Interesting. Yeah, I believe this area of conflict is kind of similar to what we see all across the world. And someone coming from India, so I'm originally from India, and I can relate to this conflict to what we are observing here in India on the POK side. And from that
Yes.
perspective, I feel the way international community responds to this, it's always, kind of conflicting at times. So can you tell us how has the international community responded to the Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and what role have they played in resolution, or possibly kind of finding some solution to the conflict?
Well, NATO has been very vocal to call for. Um, it's been not very effective to date. There's been EU delegates that have gone down there, and there's a video of I think a member of the German Bundestag down there, and she's kind of having an argument with the with the protesters, and they're just not really responding.
Yes.
It's clear that these calls for de-escalation are not working, and that NATO is becoming pretty desperate for this to go away, it seems. Russia's been less vocal, but it has stated that it does support the ethnic Serbs living within Kosovo, and of course Russia is a ally of Serbia, so there's a real potential for tension there as well.
All right. Yeah, I think historically and culturally, the Serbians are very much, I would say, aligned or related to the Russia. And from that perspective, can you just extend a little bit on the historical and cultural context that has possibly contributed to the Serbia-Kosovo conflict?
Sure. So, I mean, just to that point, different alliances between Serbia and Russia, they go back, over a century at this point, where, back in the years prior to World War II, the Pan-Slavic movement brought Russia and Serbia into a formal alliance at the time. And that was actually the spark of the First World War, was when Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia declared war on Austria, and then, of course, the precipitation happened that resulted in the most destructive war in human history to that date. It depends on who you ask what the real historical context. I mean, if you ask like the ultra nationalists in both countries, Serbs will say that Kosovo is an integral part of their homeland that goes back to ancient times. Kosovars will say the same thing, claiming that it was part of their ancient homeland, as the Illyrians, who are believed to be the precursors of the Albanians and written about since the time of the ancient Greeks. The truth is that Kosovo was under Ottoman rule up until the 19th century, whereas Serbia had gained independence at much earlier times than that. The area was quite Islamized. A lot of ethnic Albanians had moved in, and there were various points of tension. But in the post-World War II era, Yugoslavia had recognized some autonomy for the region. There was a relative peace within the country. The country had achieved quite a lot in terms of living standards and interethnic harmony. That all broke down with the fall of Yugoslavia in 91. Or 89 and 91. starting in '89, Slobodan Milosevic had been encouraging Serbian settlement of the region, and it kind of ramped up since then until the late '90s, when as many as 850,000 ethnic Albanians were forcibly expelled into either neighboring Albania or Macedonia. There were a lot of massacres that occurred at the time as well, and there were things like such as the destruction of mosques and cultural sites on both sides. There were ethnic Albanian gangs that were also taking part in the destruction of Serbian Orthodox churches as well. So it was a very very brutal war between the two sides that only ended with the severe bombing campaign that was initiated by NATO in 1999 that
All
forced
right.
the Serbian army north. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have seen like the stability was there, as you mentioned, during the Yugoslavia, and then we saw the rise of, I think, NATO forces, the United States coming into the play. And somewhere, I believe, though I think the Eastern Europe was, kind of made independent, but somewhere we observed, like, some of this conflict areas still are thriving. And I think these are the repercussions of the actions somewhere, taken by the Allied forces at that time. So, just following up on this, can you tell us how has this conflict potentially impacted the lives of ordinary people living in the region, and what are and from your perspective, I mean, like, if you are comfortable to, of course, share with us, what are some personal experiences, stories that shed light on human toll of the conflict?
Well, I know. I mean, if you go back not that long ago, certainly within both of our lifetimes, there were instances of massacres and widespread ethnic cleansing that would still be very fresh in the minds of a lot of people in on both sides of the conflict. Um, and I think that that informs a lot of the decision making to date. Uh, it's also been a very tough go for both countries economically because they both exist in this sort of isolated state. Uh, Kosovo won't be granted access to the EU over its contentious issues, and so it's really cut off from regional markets. Serbia is similarly being kind of a pariah within the region, and is now increasingly surrounded by NATO member states. So both countries have suffered a lot in the years, during and since the conflict. You know, the numbers kind of speak to themselves, where you had over 300,000 ethnic Serbs living in Kosovo, and that number's fallen
Yeah.
by half. So it's definitely an issue, and I think a lot of people, especially a lot of the younger ones, have left for better opportunities, either in Serbia or abroad, and that's true of both countries. If you look at both Kosovo and Serbia, you're finding a lot of people from both countries migrating either to Europe or elsewhere to seek opportunities abroad, because there's just limited opportunities there. So it's it's been a very difficult past, almost 3 decades now since this whole issue came to a boiling point. In terms
Yes.
of personal stories, I'm not I don't know people personally. I wouldn't want to speak for them, but I know, just having researched the issue, that it would be a tremendous human toll for everybody involved.
Yes. I think, yeah, I would like to share, kind of some experiences from my side a little bit, because I have had some of my former university batchmates from Serbia, and I believe I was still able. I mean, when I came here in Europe, I was unaware about, the details of the Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and the way, I started, becoming good friends with them. Then, slowly, gradually, I started, realizing some thought process, or I mean the scars of the conflict, that the Yugoslavia breakup and all, those still
Mhm.
thrive in the minds of young generation. Of course, not to the I haven't seen at least my batchmates to going to the violent level and all, but
Yeah.
they say, but it is still, somewhere the memory is still like fresh, because it's not even less than, it's less than 50 years. So I think the memories are still fresh in the minds of young generation. And just,
Yes.
kind of, yeah, so just kind of, following up on the same lines, I'd like to little bit take, deep dive into the patriotism and national aspect. So what role does nationalism play in perpetuating the Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and how is that shaped the uh, political landscape of the region?
Well, it's very interesting, the role nationalism comes to play in geopolitical conflict. It's the whole Yugoslav experiment post World War II kind of demonstrates that nationalism can be contained when there's kind of a common vision for a place and a people. Like, I mean, you know, when people are taken care of, when the system is stable, when when there's opportunity for jobs, etc., nationalist tensions tend not to boil up. I mean, you see this across the world when ethnic tensions tend to become at their highest when there's a deeper economic issue, and that's sort of exactly what happened with starting in the 80s. I mean, if you look at like footage from the 84 Olympics in Sarajevo, you'd have no idea that entire city would be just bombed flat within a decade. You know, uh, it it can happen, and it can happen very fast. Now, I think you have these forces that have been
Yes.
galvanized in internationalism on both sides, and policymakers tend to be more practical, with exceptions. I mean, certainly during the Slobodan Milosevic years in Serbia, this is the proof in the pudding, where if you allow one of these radicals to get
Yes.
into the reins of powers, they can really destroy a country.
Yes.
Uh,
And- yeah.
but now moderate, at least in practice and maybe not belief, but in both countries, they have to appeal to a constituency that has that the uh, taken off the jar of you see in Serbia, President Vucic is playing a very careful line between trying not to ignite a war, but at the same time appealing to his more radical base. Him being a center right politician himself, so I can see this creating a much more likely stalemate moving forward, and kind of kicking the can down the road if this doesn't result in an outright war at present.
All right. Yeah, I think as you gave this contest in detail about the current and the past situation, I believe it is like not fair to say that we'll reach a steady, or very quick, I would say very quick reconciliation in this conflict. But still, as we say that the humans always have hope. So how does the Serbia-Kosovo conflict impact the regional stability, and possibly what are the broader geopolitical implications of the ongoing tensions?
Well, regionally, I mean, the possibility of a war between these two countries could be quite devastating and quite brutal. I mean, I think the first victims of such a thing would probably be Serbs living within Kosovo, and the escalation could get so much worse. If NATO were to get involved again, as it did in '99, you're dealing with a much different geopolitical context. 1999, Russia was uh, a much less assertive country, a much less coherently run country, with a much less effective leadership. That's not to say that Vladimir Putin's regime is the exact opposite of those things. I think in the last year or so has really proven that it's not. But you're dealing with a much more geopolitically assertive Russia today that would have a lot more to say and perhaps do if this conflict were to boil over to a point of outright war between the two sides and result in NATO intervention. The consequences for that, are beyond extraction or abstraction, but you can certainly imagine worst case scenarios of heightening nuclear tensions if that were to be the case today.
Yes, I believe I think we have discussed most of the issues and in this part of Serbia-Kosovo conflict, and as I said, like it is not really fair to say that we'll reach a reconciliation very quickly. But still, from your perspective, what steps can be taken to foster dialogue and understanding, both the sides?
Well, I think there's been some hope. Like, for instance, the two sides were able to reach some kind of de facto agreement over the license plate issue. And I think we're having some kind of open dialogue and working relationship between the two of them, regardless of the political positions of each. I mean, it is difficult to recognize, for countries to operate, to have bilateral relations when one doesn't recognize the other. But certainly working dialogue can be established, and I think should. I think that NATO should encourage bilateral dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade in this matter. In terms of the bigger picture, I mean, it's also a question of whether Serbia remains a steadfast ally of Russia, and where things go with Russia with regard to its position geopolitically. I mean, there are some out there who say that Russia is in the midst of a major geopolitical decline, and that this latest coup attempt is perhaps proof of that. I don't know if I would go so far as to say that, but there have been rumblings within Serbia that could show a little bit of wavering on that alliance. For instance, Vucic, it was very unclear at one point that whether or not Serbia would support Ukraine,
Yes.
And sell ammunition to Ukraine in the war. Vucic has come out and denied that personally, and it's very clear that Serbia's ultranationalist community does not support Ukraine, but rather Russia in the conflict. And there are Serbian volunteers within Russia or within Ukraine fighting for Russia at this time. However, the ultranationalists don't necessarily represent the entire population. And Serbia is a country where things can change politically. I mean, Vucic, who is an elected leader,
Yes.
if you go back to 2000, Slobodan Milosevic was overthrown in a violent coup. So I think he's
Yes.
very cautious of playing both sides and playing it very careful in this regard to
Yes.
avoid a similar fate. And I think the last thing he would want would be a war, given the fate of Milosevic, where he died in custody in The Hague. So I think
Yes.
it's a very it's very difficult to say, but you could see a shift in Serbia's geopolitical position,
Yes.
especially if it wants to gain some of the economic benefits of regional integration, which it's been deprived of for 2 decades now.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
that
think
would, of course, I think require some de facto recognition. I'm sorry, go ahead,
yes.
Omkar.
Yes. I think yeah, I was saying that you're absolutely right about this. And I believe the world we live in, of course, from the economic side I'm speaking about, is that somewhere I think the economic stability or the need for economic stability, I would mention in this way, that it pushes the countries to, possibly, if not fully resolve the conflict, then at least reach some mutual agreement where, both the sides are at, possibly on a profit side. And maybe possibly we can see this thing happening later in the future between Serbia and other regional like its allies, or possibly in even the non-allied nations that he has. So yeah, I think the conflict might not, cool down very quickly. But yeah, as you said, like, the dialogue between both the countries is very much necessary, and I think it
Yeah.
should be consistent. I think it's very similar. It's kind of weird, but it's very similar because in India also we are observing the same thing. Like, the current government is not trying to have a dialogue with Pakistan,
Mhm.
and I think that is somewhere, kind of hurting the sentiments of, I mean, the Kashmiri people. And I
Yes.
believe, like, it doesn't actually affect the people living outside of Kashmir, both in Pakistan and India, but it actually affects the people who are a part of that specific region where the conflict is going on. But the rest of the country is not affected at all on both the
Mhm.
side. But I think that's the
Yes.
reason, like, I think the dialogue is very much necessary. And let's hope, I think we have came up with a lot of questions during this conversation. Maybe in future, definitely we'll be able to take some bits and points and create a one more episode, follow-up episode on this Serbia-Kosovo conflict dedicated.
Sure.
And as we proceed ahead, I think we'll be taking jump directly into now the drug trafficking and its connection with the terrorism. So the further part of the conversation will be continued in the next episode. Stay tuned.